There is a photograph from June of 1968 that almost everybody on Earth has seen, even if they think they have not. A woman kneeling in a hotel kitchen corridor, one hand lifted, palm out, the gesture half shielding, half pushing back a crowd. Her husband is on the floor behind her. Within hours, that picture will be wired across the planet as the image of American grief. It will run in textbooks. It will run in documentaries. It will run on the night of her death more than half a century later, captioned again with the same 4 words people always reach for: true love, devoted wife, American story. It is the wrong reading. Not because the woman in the picture was not devoted. She was, in a way that should embarrass the word. It is the wrong reading because the kitchen photograph is the last frame of a film, and the first reel of that film begins in a snowstorm in Quebec in December of 1945, with a 17-year-old girl who had not yet been allowed to want anything in particular, watching her older sister hold the attention of a Kennedy boy. Her name was Ethel Skakel. She was loud, fearless, funny in the way that makes priests nervous and brothers helpless. Her roommate at Manhattanville College was a Kennedy girl, Jean Kennedy, and Jean brought her north for a family ski trip at Mont Tremblant. Among the Kennedys on that trip was a young man named Robert Francis Kennedy, who at that moment was not paying the slightest attention to the younger Skakel sister. He had been courting Patricia, the older one, the one the family considered the prettier and the calmer, for roughly 2 years. Ethel watched from the edges, the way she would always watch before she moved. She organized games, she cracked jokes, she inserted herself into every room with the energy of a girl auditioning for a part she had not yet been offered. Bobby, for his part, was still half attached to Patricia. The relationship was already cooling, but cooling slowly, in the way relationships cool when neither party quite admits it yet. The loud Skakel girl registered, but as background, as a sister, as furniture you do not yet notice. When the attachment to Patricia finally frayed, Bobby turned, almost experimentally, to the younger one. By then, the die was already cast in ways neither of them understood. Bobby was the 7th Kennedy child, the one considered too slight, too bookish, unathletic by the family's punishing standards, overshadowed by the ghost of a dead older brother and by the gravitational pull of Jack, who already had the magic that Bobby would spend the rest of his life trying to borrow. What Ethel offered him, and what no one else in his life was offering in quite the same form, was belief. Unearned, unconditional, ferocious belief. She was his loudest cheerleader before he had done a single thing worth cheering. The Skakels she came from were, in money, a step above the Kennedys and a country mile below them in discipline. Her father, George Skakel, had begun life as a railroad clerk earning $8 a week. He built Great Lakes Carbon into one of the largest privately held companies in America. In 1936, the family moved into a 31-room manor on Lake Avenue in Greenwich, Connecticut, and the household, as described years later by Greenwich neighbors who watched it grow up and out, simply ran wild. Guns, wrecked cars, heavy drinking, the Skakel boys treating the town as a private amusement park. George himself was Protestant, and he kept a careful, almost formal distance from the religious life of the house. Ethel's mother, Anne, was something else entirely. She was a fiercely devout Catholic, a woman who drilled the faith into her daughters with the same intensity other women drilled piano. 2 lessons landed in Ethel early, and they landed deep. God is not negotiable. Family embarrassments are not discussed. She absorbed both and would carry both for the rest of her life. The contradiction that anyone who knew her as a young woman remembers is the same one that would define her as an old one. She was the girl famous for pranks, and also, in almost any room, the most rigidly Catholic person present. Friends recalled decades later, in interviews with biographers, that at one point during her school years, she seriously considered becoming a nun. The idea did not survive contact with a particular Kennedy, but it left a mark. Years into the courtship, when Bobby was dragging his feet with the moralistic slowness that the family would come to recognize as part of his operating system, the convent surfaced again. Half as threat, half as tease. The competition, she reportedly joked, was not another girl, it was God. By 1946, Bobby was still half attached to Patricia, and Ethel had already begun reshaping her life around the Kennedys. She volunteered for Jack Kennedy's first congressional race in Boston. At Manhattanville, she wrote her senior thesis on Jack's book, Why England Slept, a piece of work that would have read, to anyone paying attention, as a declaration of intent. A 1994 Hostel biography would later claim, on the strength of unnamed friends, that her first crush had actually been Jack, not Bobby. The claim rests on attributed recollection and cannot be proven either way. What can be said with certainty is that by the time she was 21, the marriage she would enter was no longer a question of if, but of when, and the only person in her life who did not understand that was Bobby. What Bobby understood when he finally made the decision was arithmetic. Her money did not hurt. Her Catholicism did not hurt. The fact that she would subordinate every other project on earth to him and to his family was the main event. He chose carefully. He chose a girl from a 31-room house full of secrets. A girl whose family embarrassed her in a way that could be weaponized. A girl who had been taught that the only acceptable response to family chaos was silence, endurance, and a very clean pair of shoes. In February of 1950, the engagement was announced. On June 17, 1950, she married him at St. Mary's Church in Greenwich. The Boston Globe ran a single dry line about the wedding that read, in print, the quiet part that the two families had spent decades negotiating behind the scenes. The marriage unites two large fortunes. That sentence, plain as it was, carried the whole arrangement. A fortune from railroads and carbon, a fortune from bootlegging and politics, a loud bride who knew how to smile through things that were not discussed, a groom who knew exactly what he was getting and had decided it was enough. The Skakels turned the wedding reception into what one witness would later describe, with the dry understatement of a man who had seen a lot, as a demolition derby of drunken pranks. Ethel's brothers and their friends wrecked enough of the celebration to mortify the bride. The Kennedys, for their part, treated the day as a campaign stop, with Jack as best man working the room like a man running for office in his own living room. In that single afternoon, the next 18 years were previewed in miniature. One side disciplined, choreographed, political. The other side wild, rich, devout, and embarrassed. Ethel chose, in front of everyone, the side that had made her marry upward. She would spend the rest of her life, in private, outrunning the side she had come from. The 17-year-old at Mont Tremblant had not known any of this. She had known only that a Kennedy boy was not yet looking at her, and that the next move, whatever it turned out to be, was hers. By the time the wedding photographs ran, she had been auditioning for 6 years. She had passed. The girl from Greenwich had learned, in a 31-room house run by a Protestant father and a Catholic mother, exactly one skill that the rest of the country would spend the next half-century underestimating: how to bury a family's truth and smile through the funeral. How to stand inside a family that was not yours and outperform it at its own specialty. How to love a man so completely that he could never quite see the price of it. Bobby got the photograph. Ethel got the rest. And the rest was the story. The marriage was not a marriage. It was an induction. And Ethel walked into it with her eyes wide open and her mouth already shaped into the smile the Kennedy machine would require from her for the next 18 years. She had spent her adolescence studying the family the way a cadet studies a flag. By the time she reached the altar, she already knew the rules, and the rules were not negotiable. On June 17, 1950, at St. Mary's Church in Greenwich, the bride wore white and the bride's brothers drank the reception into the ground. The Boston Globe covered the wedding in one line that doubled as a confession. The marriage unites two large fortunes. Two fortunes. Two empires. Two families that did not, in any private room, actually like each other very much, and had agreed, in the way such agreements are made across generations of American wealth, to behave. The ceremony was Catholic. The reception was a campaign event. Jack, the best man, worked the room as though he were running for office in his own living room, and in a sense, he was, because the Kennedys understood that every gathering, including a wedding, including a funeral, was a chance to enlarge the family. The Skakels turned their half of the celebration into what one witness would later call, with the dry understatement of a man who had seen things, a demolition derby of drunken pranks, enough wreckage to mortify the bride. The bride did not flinch. She had already decided which family she was going to belong to, and it was not the one on her side of the church. From that afternoon forward, Ethel oriented her existence toward Hyannisport and away from Greenwich. She would, in practical terms, all but disown her own people. The Skakels would become a country she had emigrated from and no longer answered mail from. Inside the Kennedy compound, the rules were written in a hand nobody argued with. Old Joe set the schedules, the expectations, the political priorities. Rose set the religious tone. The brothers competed at everything, and the wives were graded, formally or informally, on enthusiasm and output. Jackie, who had married Jack, retreated in the books, into Paris, into a kind of cool, aristocratic remove that confused the family and enchanted the press. Joan, who had married Ted, retreated into music and a quiet life of her own. Ethel could only burn the road back to Greenwich. She thrived exactly where Jackie suffered. She loved the games. She loved the family jokes. She loved Rose's novenas. She produced grandchildren at a pace that delighted the father-in-law, who measured devotion in births. The family gave her a nickname, the kind that is half compliment and half knife. They called her more Kennedy than the Kennedys. Only someone who knows she was not born one tries that hard. The cost of that eagerness was the part nobody at Hyannisport was interested in auditing. There was no room of her own. There was no identity that had not been issued by the family. There was no fallback if the family withdrew approval. Jackie could vanish into a museum in Paris and return whenever she pleased. Joan could hide behind a piano. Ethel had nowhere to hide, because she had given everywhere she had away. The first rule of the system was simple: produce. Rose had managed 9, Ethel would manage 11, which works out, if you do the arithmetic, to roughly one child every 18 months from 1951 through 1968. That is the headline. The arithmetic underneath it is a body pregnant almost continuously for 17 years, with a few months of recovery and a few months of grief wedged between. The second rule was to serve the machine. In 1952, the young couple moved into a Boston rooming house so Bobby could run Jack's Senate campaign. Pregnant Ethel organized the tea parties, the neighborhood coffees, the small formal events that put the candidate in front of thousands of women voters. The Kennedy men ran the speeches. The Kennedy wives ran the rooms. Bobby's career ran through Jack. Jack's career ran through their father. Ethel's job was to make sure the household kept working while the men were elsewhere doing the part of the job that ended up in the history books. The third rule was the one nobody said out loud. The husband belonged to the family first. Bobby was prosecuting Jimmy Hoffa. Bobby was on the McClellan Committee. Bobby was running the Justice Department as Attorney General. Bobby was a presence in the house measured in dinners and absences, and the legend that he always made it home for the meal does not mention how often the meal was the entire appearance. In October of 1955, when she had just delivered her fourth child, her parents died in a private plane crash near Union City, Oklahoma. The grief was intense and almost entirely private, sealed off the way Ann Skakel had taught her to seal off anything that could not be discussed at the dinner table. Within a year, Ethel and Bobby bought Hickory Hill, a 13-bedroom estate in McLean, Virginia, from Jack and Jackie, who were letting it go after Jackie's stillbirth. Ethel moved into the house where her sister-in-law's hopes had collapsed. She turned it into the loudest address in Washington. The public myth of Hickory Hill is one of those American images that almost writes itself. 11 children. A menagerie that, depending on the decade, included horses, dogs, and at one point a sea lion. Touch football on the lawn, cabinet officials in the drawing room arguing about philosophy, parties that ended on more than one documented occasion with fully dressed guests in the swimming pool. In 1962, the historian Arthur Schlesinger, who was no amateur of that household, went into that pool in his suit, and Washington talked about it for weeks. The press framed Ethel as the anti-Jackie, unpretentious, fun, fertile, devout, the kind of hostess voters and family members and reporters all felt lucky to be invited by. Behind the myth, Bobby was almost never home. The McClellan years and the Attorney General years turned him into a visitor in his own house. Ethel ran 13 bedrooms and a rotating staff essentially alone, pregnant most of the time, her mother and father dead, her brothers scattered or worse. Staff and tradesman accounts, filtered through a 1994 unauthorized biography, describe bills unpaid for months, a revolving door of governesses and cooks, and a woman who could be generous one hour and volcanic the next. These are allegations from interested witnesses, and they must be flagged as such. But the arithmetic underneath them is not in dispute. Between 1951 and 1968, Ethel was pregnant 11 times, buried both parents and a brother, ran a 13-bedroom estate, and served as hostess for what was, by general agreement, the most socially demanding household in Washington. The husband she was doing it for was prosecuting the most famous labor leader in America and running the Justice Department for his brother's administration. Even sympathetic chroniclers concede an asymmetry. She worshipped him with a totality he did not visibly return. The wife's job description did not include asking questions. Her public posture never wavered by a millimeter, which leaves the record with two possibilities and no way to choose between them. Either there was nothing to forgive, or forgiving silently was itself another duty. The rumor mill did its work. The Marilyn Monroe rumor is weaker than its fame. Evan Thomas, Larry Tye, the archives, hundreds of interviews, all reached the same conclusion. There is no solid evidence of an affair between Bobby and Monroe. The story grew out of a handful of documented meetings and was inflated by conspiracy writers long after both of them were dead and could no longer correct the record. More credible whispers, attributed in Oppenheimer's hostile book to anonymous friends of Ethel, suggest Bobby had other flings. In one account, just like Jack, with the wives of friends. That line is on the record. It is also unattributed and interested and cannot be verified. What can be said is that even the chroniclers most sympathetic to Bobby concede that the marriage did not run on equality. It ran on her effort and his absence. There was also a rivalry that nobody at Hyannisport talked about and everybody felt. Jackie got the White House. Jackie got the magazine covers. Jackie got the breathy voice and the grand manners and the mystique. Ethel, who had sacrificed more to belong than Jackie ever had, would never wear the crown. Late, second-hand recollections describe Ethel privately mocking Jackie's voice and her airs, while privately smarting at the fact that the woman who gave less was the one history would remember more fondly. It is the oldest story in dynastic marriages, the Earth Mother and the Aesthete. Only one of them gets remembered as iconic. In November of 1963, in Dallas, Jack was killed. Bobby fell into a depression that biographers describe as gaunt, withdrawn, the man wearing his dead brother's old coat, disappearing into a grief that lasted the better part of a year. The person who could reach him in that period was not always his wife. Bobby and Jackie were bound together in mourning, two people tied by the same lost man. Ethel's faith made grief almost a theological error. Jack was surely in heaven. Sorrow on this side of it was unseemly. She kept the household loud. She kept sorrow off limits. Her response was activity, more children, the relentless push to get Bobby moving again. In 1964, Bobby ran for Senate from New York. Ethel campaigned pregnant. The machine restarted. Then the Skagels began dying the way Skagels died, in planes, in private, out of the public record. In September of 1966, her brother George Jr., who had been running Great Lakes Carbon, died in a plane crash that echoed the parents. Roughly a year later, George Jr.'s widow choked to death at home during a meal. 4 Skakel deaths inside 2 decades, and virtually none of them entered Ethel's public story. There would be more Skakel trouble later, a nephew tried in one of America's most notorious murder cases, the kind of family scandal that other families spend years excavating. The Kennedys would never excavate it. Ethel's skill, the one she had learned first, was containment. In a 31-room house full of secrets, you do not explain your family. You outrun it. She had learned to outrun Greenwich. She had learned to outrun grief. She had learned to outrun every version of herself that was not the version the Kennedy machine required. By the end of the 1960s, she was a mother of almost a dozen, the hostess of the loudest house in Washington, the sister-in-law who had given more than any of them and been given less in return, and the keeper of a family archive that did not yet know it was an archive. She was also, without anyone in the family quite noticing, becoming the one who would outlast all of them. The 1968 campaign was, in a way that Bobby's own advisors would spend decades debating, Ethel's doing. He agonized for months over the question of whether to challenge a sitting president of his own party. The advisors split. Brother Ted, the surviving one, urged caution in the language of a man who understood exactly what was being weighed. Ethel pushed. The biographer Evan Thomas, who had access to the family and the archives and the surviving principals, would later describe her as Bobby's most consistent advocate of a race for the White House. She teased him for hesitating. She invoked his dead brother. She believed, with the same ferocity she had brought to everything since she was 17, that Bobby was America's best hope. That belief was, at the same time, a private claim. The crown that had gone to Jackie's husband had never gone to hers. If Bobby won, the woman who had given more than anyone to the Kennedy machine would finally be wearing it. In March of 1968, Bobby declared, Ethel was pregnant with her 11th child and on the trail beside him, radiating the family circus image the Kennedys had been selling to the country since Jack first ran for Congress. For months, the marriage looked like the myth it had always pretended to be in the photograph pages. Two people fused into one purpose, two bodies moving through crowds as a single organism, hands reaching for both of them at once. Her wedding ring reportedly torn off more than once in the crush and put back on without ceremony. After 17 years of waiting rooms and delivery rooms, she was standing where the history was actually happening. 11 weeks. That is how long the partnership lasted. 11 weeks is also, not coincidentally, how long she had been visibly pregnant on the trail. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. Bobby, against police advice, climbed onto a flatbed truck in a black neighborhood of Indianapolis and delivered an unscripted speech that would be replayed in classrooms and in documentaries and on anniversaries for the rest of the century. It is one of the great American speeches. Ethel was with him on that trip, visibly pregnant, the two of them holding the crowd together with the particular authority of a couple who had learned, over almost 2 decades, how to be looked at without breaking. The crowds treated them as one organism, and her hand was in his, and her ring was on her finger. And the photograph of that night is the kind of image that historians reach for when they want to explain what American politics used to look like. On June 4th, 1968, Bobby won the California primary. Earlier that same day at Malibu, he had pulled his 12-year-old son David out of a dangerous undertow. The detail survives in multiple accounts because of what followed, and because of the boy who was not yet a man and did not yet know that the worst hour of his life would arrive within 12 hours of the best one of his father's. Just after midnight on June 5th, walking through the pantry corridor of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, Bobby was shot. The exact corridor in the Ambassador, in the working language of that night, was the kitchen, and the name is stuck in the record the way such names do. Ethel was 3 months pregnant and walking a step or two behind him. She stepped into the frame of what would become, within hours, one of the most famous photographs in American history. Kneeling, one hand raised, the gesture half shielding, half pushing the crowd back. The posture of a woman who had spent 18 years learning how to be useful in a crisis and was now performing the role on the largest stage the country had ever built for her. What the cameras did not show, and what would not surface in the record for years, was what was happening one floor up. David, the boy Bobby had pulled from the Malibu surf the same afternoon, was watching his father's shooting live on a hotel television. Alone. In a room with a view of nothing that mattered. The distance between a father saving a son's life at midday and a son watching his father die at midnight was, on that night, a single elevator ride. Bobby died the next day. A 1994 unauthorized biography claimed, on the strength of sources the family has never confirmed, that the family quietly decided to end life support after Bobby was declared beyond recovery. The account remains Oppenheimer's. The family has never detailed those hours in public, and the most consequential decisions of that night are still, in the historical record, his word against the silence of people who were in the room and have chosen not to speak. On December 12th of 1968, 6 months after the funeral, Ethel gave birth to a daughter. The child's name was Rory. Her father had been dead for half a year. The arithmetic of that sentence is the kind of fact that biographers tend to put in parentheses because the parentheses are the only honest place for it. The funeral came first. Somewhere on the order of 2 million people lined the tracks as a train carried Bobby's body from New York to Washington. Ethel, weeks into pregnancy and days into widowhood, walked the length of the cars. She thanked supporters one by one. Reporters who were aboard that train would return to the story for the rest of their careers, because the image of a pregnant widow walking past a country in mourning was not the kind of thing a press corps forgets. The performance of composure was genuinely brave. It was also the moment, whether she intended it or not, that she took over the family business of grief and began, in front of 2 million witnesses, to run it her way. The country expected her to disappear into black. The country had a model in mind. Jackie had done it in 1963, and the country had loved her for it, and the country expected the same script from the second sister-in-law. Ethel did something harder and stranger. Within months, she helped establish the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial, the seed of what would become the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization. She installed herself as the permanent keeper of her dead husband's causes: migrant workers, Native American rights, the poor. The names of those causes would appear on letterhead for the rest of her life, and they would appear there because a widow had decided they would, and because a widow had decided, more consequentially, what would not appear on any letterhead at all. She refused, essentially forever, to speak about the assassination, not to reporters, far more consequentially, not to her own children. The refusal was not a single decision. It was a weather system that settled over Hickory Hill and stayed. Older sons would later tell interviewers, in particular the writers Peter Collier and David Horowitz, that their father's death was simply not discussable at home. Grief went underground the way Skakel grief had always gone underground, sealed off by the same woman who had been sealed off from her own grief at 16 by a mother who believed that family embarrassments were not discussed. The price of that weather system would not be paid all at once. It would be paid across decades, in boarding schools and rehabs and Palm Beach hotel rooms, in the slow wreckage of boys who had been raised in the loudest house in Washington, and then told, in the loudest possible silence, that the central fact of their family was not a subject. The country saw the widow as a figure of mourning. Inside Hickory Hill, the mourning had been converted into a different kind of discipline, the kind the Kennedys had always specialized in, and Ethel had learned it from them, and was now teaching it, in her own handwriting, to her own children. The kitchen photograph, the one with the raised hand, would run again and again for the rest of her life. It would run on the night of her death in 2024, captioned with the same 4 words people always reach for: true love, devoted wife, American story. The reading is wrong. Not because the woman in the picture was not devoted, she was, in a way that should embarrass the word. It is wrong because the photograph is the last frame of a film, and the woman kneeling in the kitchen corridor is not asking the crowd for anything. She is managing it. She has been managing rooms since she was a 17-year-old at Mont Tremblant, auditioning for a part the Kennedys had not yet decided to give her. She managed the wedding reception in Greenwich while her brothers wrecked it. She managed 13 bedrooms in McLean while her husband prosecuted Jimmy Hoffa. She managed the Senate campaign trail in 1964 while pregnant. She managed the country in 1968 while pregnant. She managed the funeral train while pregnant. She will manage, for another 56 years, the archive of what is allowed to be said about the man whose hand she is shielding the crowd from. Bobby got the martyrdom, Ethel got the rest. And the rest, as the country would slowly learn, was the whole story. America expected the widow to disappear into black. The country had a model in mind. Jackie had done it in '63, and the country had loved her for it. And the country expected the same script from the second sister-in-law. Ethel did something harder and stranger. She did not disappear. She reorganized. Within months of the funeral, she helped establish the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial, the seed of what would become the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization. She installed herself as the permanent keeper of her dead husband's causes: migrant workers, Native American rights, the poor. The names of those causes would appear on letterhead for the rest of her life, and they would appear there because a widow had decided they would, and because a widow had decided, more consequentially, what would not appear on any letterhead at all. She refused, essentially forever, to speak about the assassination, not to reporters, far more consequentially, not to her own children. The refusal was not a single decision. It was a weather system that settled over Hickory Hill and stayed. Older sons would later tell interviewers, in particular the writers Peter Collier and David Horowitz, that their father's death was simply not discussable at home. Grief went underground the way Skakel grief had always gone underground, sealed off by the same woman who had been sealed off from her own grief at 16 by a mother who believed that family embarrassments were not discussed. The price of that weather system would not be paid all at once. It would be paid across decades, in boarding schools and rehabs and Palm Beach hotel rooms, in the slow wreckage of boys who had been raised in the loudest house in Washington and then told, in the loudest possible silence, that the central fact of their family was not a subject. A 1994 Hostel biography, drawing on unnamed staff and tradesmen, described the estate by then as Horror Hill, painted a portrait of rages and unpaid bills and a woman who could be generous one hour and volcanic the next. Those accounts are allegations from an unauthorized book, and they must be flagged as such. The broader wreckage, however, is not in dispute. David, the boy from the Malibu undertow, the boy who had watched his father shooting alone on a hotel television, died of a drug overdose in a Palm Beach hotel in April of 1984. He was 28. The family official story had no room for the years of addiction that led to the room. Michael died in a reckless skiing accident in 1997, months after a scandal of his own. Ethel buried 2 sons the way she had buried parents, a brother, and a husband. Publicly composed, privately sealed, theatrical. Theatrical in the precise sense of the word, meaning of or pertaining to the theater, meaning performed for an audience that is paid for the privilege of not being shown what is happening backstage. Inside the family, the second-choice sister-in-law became the moral center of gravity. With Jack and Bobby gone, Ethel's 11 children made her household the dynasty's future. Her approval started to matter in ways it never had while her husband was alive. In 1969, Chappaquiddick disgraced Ted. Oppenheimer's sources, late and interested, describe Ethel privately furious at the surviving brother for failing the standard her dead one had set. The account is consistent with everything else known about how she ranked the men in the family, and it is also unverifiable, and the family has never commented on it. By 1970, she was, in practical terms, absorbing the family that had absorbed her in 1950. She never remarried, 56 years of widowhood. The singer Andy Williams escorted her to events through the 1970s. Gossip columns married them off repeatedly. Both insisted for decades that the friendship was platonic. No evidence ever contradicted them. In 1991, a People magazine interview produced the line that would define her second act. Remarrying would be adultery. 5 words. 5 words that closed a question the country had been politely asking for 23 years, and that opened, in the same breath, the question of what, exactly, she had been married to in the first place. After the assassination, the National Archives agreed to something almost without precedent in American political history. They let Ethel Kennedy take control of her husband's papers. Not the government, the widow. For more than 4 decades, dozens of boxes from Bobby's years at the center of American power, including material touching the Cuban Missile Crisis, sat at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library under family control. Historians who wanted them had to ask the Kennedys. Many asked, most waited. Scholars complained publicly for years that the fullest record of Robert Kennedy, and of the marriage, was hostage to the person with the most invested in one particular version of it. Access, when it came selectively. Arthur Schlesinger, the same friend who had gone into the Hickory Hill pool in his suit in 1962, was granted papers for his affectionate 1978 biography, the one the family blessed. Writers the family trusted got in. Others waited or worked around the edges. Every waiting year hardened the love story version into settled history. Substantial releases only began around 2012, tied to the 50th anniversary of the missile crisis. Even then, the family's fingerprints were on the process. The woman remembered as the passive half of a great man's story spent half a century as the gatekeeper of that story's evidence. She curated the softer channels too. The definitive 2012 documentary Ethel was made by her own daughter Rory, the child born after the assassination, with Ethel's cooperation and on Ethel's terms. The film is unusually intimate by Kennedy standards. It is also, in its final minutes, an act of controlled refusal. When the conversation approaches June of 1968, the 83-year-old matriarch waves the subject away on camera. The refusal made the final cut. The filmmakers understood what they had. The silence was the portrait. In 2014, President Obama hung the Presidential Medal of Freedom around her neck. She died in Boston on October 10, 2024, at 96. 3 presidents eulogized her. The obituaries ran the kitchen photograph one more time, captioned with the love story. It is the wrong reading. Not because the woman in the picture was not devoted. She was, in a way that should embarrass the word. It is wrong because the kneeling woman's raised hand was not signaling helplessness. It was signaling, with the same discipline she had been signaling since 17, that this room, this moment, this country's grief would be managed on her terms. The hand in the photograph is not asking, it is curating. She took the papers, she built the foundation. She decided which questions her own children could ask, which boxes historians could open, which version of the 18-year marriage, the second-choice courtship, the vanished Skagels, the absent husband, the unexamined rumors, the sons who broke under the silence, would survive as the official love story. The girl from Greenwich had learned one skill first, in a 31-room house full of secrets run by a Protestant father and a Catholic mother. How to bury a family's truth and smile through the funeral. How to stand inside a family that was not yours and outperform it at its own specialty. She married into a dynasty, and in the end, ran its archive. Bobby got the martyrdom, Ethel got the archive, and the archive, not the marriage, is the thing she never let anyone touch. There is a photograph from June of 1968 that almost everybody on Earth has seen. A woman kneeling in a hotel kitchen corridor, one hand lifted, palm out. Her husband on the floor behind her. America read it as a love story. It was a management decision. She had been making management decisions since a ski trip in Quebec in December of 1945, and she would keep making them, in the same posture, for the next 56 years, until the country that had been reading the photograph wrong for half a century finally had to read the obituary and notice, too late, that the woman kneeling in the kitchen was not the supporting character in somebody else's story. She was the archivist. She had always been the archivist. The love story was simply what she had decided to file under public access.